Chapter 2, The Chemistry of Living Things, Screencast 4. Now, the next two screencasts will be focusing primarily on biological molecules. The first of two will be looking at carbohydrates and lipids, and the last screencast will be focusing on protein and nucleic acids. Together we refer to these four as major biological molecules. But before we get into a lot of detail, let's look at this particular table. This table is showing the 12 most common and important elements in living organisms. What I do want you to be comfortable with here is the big three. So carbon, hydrogen, and oxygen. Together, these three elements account for 90% of total body weight in the adult human. Think about that. That's really what we are. Okay? Carbon, hydrogen, and oxygen. That accounts for a big chunk of us. And together, the remaining elements on this chart account for 7% of total body weight. So keep that in mind. Now, carbon is really important. Carbon has the ability to form bonds very easily. There's also a branch of chemistry devoted to the study of carbon, and that actually is known as organic chemistry. And so here we're looking at carbon acting as the backbone of amino acids, the building block of protein. We're going to see carbon dioxide, and here we actually see these long carbon chains in a lipid molecule. We'll getting into a lot more detail in this as we move through this particular chapter. Now here, we're talking about two different types of chemical reactions. I briefly talked about these before. We have dehydration synthesis. This is an anabolic reaction. So I start off with small things and I create something bigger. And then I have hydrolysis reactions, which are actually catabolic. I start off with something big and break that up into its actual building blocks. So dehydration synthesis, really what we're talking about here, water is a product. So the formation of a carbohydrate, a complex carbohydrate, is a really good example of a dehydration synthesis or an anabolic reaction. Another characteristic here is these reactions require the input of energy, and water is actually a product of the reaction. Now, hydrolysis is the exact opposite. So look what I'm looking at now. So I'm actually starting off with a complex carbohydrate. Water is used to break this large molecule into smaller molecules, and these are going to be releasing energy. So catabolic in nature, breaking things down. So it is important to keep in mind these two different types of reactions. And quite often I generally describe reactions following one of two types. I'm either breaking something down, so I'm catabolic, or building something up, I'm anabolic. And if we really look at the reactions that take place in our body, it's just going back and forth between those two types of reactions overall. Now, the rest of this screencast is probably going to come across like a nutrition lecture. We're going to be focusing on carbohydrates and lipids. Now, when we look at carbohydrates, we break them down into two different types generally. We have monosaccharides, quite often known as simple sugars, and then we have polysaccharides, which we'll talk about later. Now, this slide is focusing on simple sugars, so monosaccharides and disaccharides. Now, unless I say otherwise, we're talking about 6 carbon sugars. So glucose, fructose, and galactose. Those are all 6 carbon sugars. When I talk about ribose and deoxyribose, I will be very specific when I address those, and those two are actually 5 carbon, so something to keep in mind here. Okay. Now, as noted before, monosaccharides can be linked together through dehydration synthesis reactions and form disaccharides or even larger carbohydrates. So below are 3 common disaccharides, and what I do want you to know are what they're made up of. So sucrose, glucose, and fructose. Sucrose, that's table sugar. If we look at maltose, that's 2 glucose molecules. And if I look at lactose, that's glucose and galactose. Okay. The other thing that I want to make sure that you're comfortable with is what are the big three. Okay, so when I talk about the big three monosaccharides, I'm specifically referring to 6-carbon sugars, glucose, fructose, and galactose. Now here we basically see those 5-carbon sugars, so ribose and deoxyribose. These actually are much more critical, and we'll talk about in the last screencast, and are important in nucleic acids. Here we basically see the really important ones, okay, that I kind of talked about previously. And we're also looking at the formation of disaccharides from the monosaccharides glucose and fructose to sucrose. And once again, sucrose is table sugar. Now polysaccharides, think poly, many. So now we're looking at these very, very long, large carbohydrates, and they can be either linear or branched, and that's going to have an impact on the amount of energy that's stored. And that's really the job of carbohydrates. Our body primarily uses carbohydrates for energy. Now, we store glucose in our body as glycogen. Now, we have a very limited capacity to store glycogen, and in humans, we find it primarily in 2 places, the liver and skeletal muscle, with the liver having the majority of glycogen. Now, starch is a polysaccharide that's found in plants, and that's how plants store energy. The last real common polysaccharide is cellulose. Now, we don't have the enzymes in our body to break this down, and cellulose actually plays a role in plants and provides structural support. Fiber is a really good example of cellulose, and we have different types of fiber. Specifically, we have soluble, non-soluble. Fruit is a really good example of a substance that's high in fiber. Now, next we're going to talk about lipids. Now, one other thing I want to kind of address here. We can kind of think of carbohydrates and lipids as being chemically opposite. Carbohydrates are polar, hence water soluble. Lipids are nonpolar. So now we're talking about lipid soluble, very important characteristic. Now, if we look at lipids, we have 3 really important classes. We have triglycerides, and this is the biggest and probably the most important. This is actually how we store energy in our body. So a really important role of lipid overall is energy storage. Then we have phospholipids, and phospholipids are really critical to the structure of our cell membrane. We'll spend a fair amount of time talking about this in the next chapter. Then we have steroids, and steroids are substances that are basically derived from cholesterol. So those are the big 3 when we're talking about lipids. So triglycerides, phospholipids, and steroids. Now here, if we look at a triglyceride, we're talking about something that has a glycerol backbone and 3 fatty acids. Okay, and that's had these long carbon chains. Now, triglycerides in particular, you can actually store a lot of energy. So think about that. Look at all those carbons in just a single fatty acid. There's energy associated in each one of those carbon-to-carbon bonds. Okay? Now, generally, when we talk about our triglycerides and talk about the fatty acids in particular, we talk about saturated fats. And what that means is there is a single bond between the carbons. This results in a very, very rigid structure or configuration. And when we talk about saturated fats in diet, I will call them bad fat. Okay, that just is. There's a lot of health risks associated with saturated fat. And saturated fat tends to be those that are solid at room temperature. Now, if I look at unsaturated, now we're looking at double bonds between those carbons. Now, what that does, it changes the configuration. It's not as rigid. So now we're looking at our oils. Right? So something to keep in mind. And the primary role of triglycerides are going to be energy storage. Now, phospholipids are going to be really important when we talk about the cell membrane. And they are a really interesting molecule because they have a polar head and a nonpolar tail. Now, generally, they form what's known as a bilayer. And the polar head is water soluble. And the nonpolar tail is lipid soluble. Generally, we will see a tail-to-tail configuration forming a phospholipid bilayer. That's really what our cell membrane is. So here what we're looking at is a phosphate and glycerol. That's the water-soluble component. And the other end is a fatty acid tail. Okay? And notice that polar end is always going to be facing water. So that polar head will be facing outside the cell. And the other part of the bilayer, the polar head on that side, will be facing the inside of the cell with those nonpolar tails in the middle forming a semi-permeable membrane. Now, only things that are lipid soluble can easily diffuse through that cell membrane. The last class of lipids are steroids. Now, they basically derive from cholesterol. And if we look at some examples of steroids, hormones, sex hormones in particular, so estrogen and testosterone are really good examples of steroids, but that's not it. Many of you may have had a significant inflammatory disease or infection, and you were put on prednisone. That's actually a glucocorticoid. Many of you may have had some injuries and actually needed a cortisone injection. So that's really what we're talking about when we talk about steroids overall.